It's so amazing to be up here. If you guys are seeing me for the first time, my name is Praise, and I get the privilege of not just calling this home, but also being a part of the team here, and it's such a privilege to be here. We started a series 2 weeks ago on the book of Nehemiah, and so today we are continuing that series, Nehemiah chapter 2, and I'm really, really excited. Nehemiah is a book I think I have read when I'm reading through the Bible, or like when it pops up on my reading app. But the last couple of weeks, just taking time to look at Nehemiah, I've been just amazed at the person, the story, the narrative in Nehemiah. Adrian did a fantastic job getting us started a Sunday ago, 2 Sundays ago when we started this series. And it's amazing to see what it takes when somebody has such a sense of responsibility. When I looked at chapter 1, I was struck by Nehemiah's just like boldness to look at an issue around him and say, I want to do something about that issue. Nehemiah is a guy, he's exiled, he's working for the Persian government as a cupbearer. But he feels as though he can do something bigger with his life, and he feels strongly called to go back to his home country and make a difference. And I just thought, how many of us, and Adrian even asked us the question, how many of us take note of issues in our country, issues in our workplaces, our spaces of influence, and we feel as though we just can't do anything about it. And it's amazing that Nehemiah steps beyond the feeling of apathy and actually does something about the issue. He hears that this great, beautiful city that he grew up in, I mean, really, like, it was amazing. When you read the Old Testament and you start to read how the temple was built with pure gold and it had all this beautiful fabric, and Jerusalem was just a magnificent city. And Nehemiah hears about its ruin and he weeps. In chapter 1, he weeps. He literally just moans for days, and he asks the Lord, I need to do something about this. And he feels like he has a burden in his heart to go back to his homeland and do something about it. And then in verse 8 of chapter 1, Nehemiah acknowledges that where his people are, they haven't arrived there by accident, that they're actually where they are because of the brokenness and the unfaithfulness of their hearts, that maybe, just maybe, they did not do the things that God had asked him to do. So we're going to read Nehemiah 1:8. It's going to come up on the screen, and this is what it says. It says, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizons, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Nehemiah acknowledges that the children of Israel have been yanked out of their homes, taken into captivity, living in a place that's not theirs because of their own unfaithfulness, because they didn't obey the Lord. But sure enough, they come back, God brings them back, but not everybody. Some people are still exiled, yeah? And so some people still have trauma. They don't want to go back to their home country, but some of the exiles who are in Babylon come back. And so today we pick up the story in chapter 2. Remember, Nehemiah is part of this group of Israelites who were taken into Babylonian captivity. Years after the captivity is done, some people come back. In the book of Ezra, which is just a book before Nehemiah, Ezra talks about rebuilding the temple. Then Nehemiah comes into the scene and he feels like it's his burden to build the temple wall. So we pick up the story in chapter 2, and we're going to read the full chapter. You can follow along in your Bibles, but it's also going to come up on the screen. And Nehemiah is asking the king for permission because he works under the king. So this is what chapter 2 of Nehemiah 2 says. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Verse 11 says, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I sent out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no mounts with me except the one I was on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the Jacob well and the dung gate, examining the wall of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. I know, it's a really, really long passage of scripture. But the whole book of Nehemiah is just one bold occurrence after another. It's an amazing narrative of what it looks like to really feel like God has placed a burden on your heart and you actually are going to do something about that burden. And it strikes me time and time again, Nehemiah's boldness to declare. Because remember, he's an exile. He's not living in his own country, but he's still bold to go to his employer, the king, and say, hey, I want to go back to my home country. And the king's heart is softened by God. And multiple times in chapter 2, we hear Nehemiah acknowledge, and that God was with me. The favor of the Lord was with me. And Nehemiah keeps going back and he keeps pursuing the thing that God has placed before his heart, which is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. I want us to go back to chapter 2 and just look at verse 4 and 5. When I was reading through this chapter, something stood out to me. Nehemiah goes before the king and he's scared. He lets us know at the beginning of chapter 2, he says, I had never been before the king sad. He'd never had this sort of informal conversation. Remember, he's just a cupbearer. So he's not a noble, he's not an official. He works for the government, but not at a high sort of level. And he goes boldly and he says to the king, I need to speak with you. And when he says the king, he talks to the king and sort of tells the king what he needs to tell the king. The king looks at him in verse 4 and he says, what is it that you want? In the New Living Translation, it quite literally is translated, what do you want me to do for you? The king's willingness, I think in chapter 2, is amazing to me. Like I pause and I'm amazed at the king's willingness to ask Nehemiah, could I do more for you? Could I maybe just, tell me whatever it is you want? But that's not what catches me in the passage. What catches me is that Nehemiah then prays. If you remember when we read through chapter 1 with Adrian a couple of weeks ago, if you weren't here, Nehemiah does the exact same thing. He pauses and he prays. And I paused because I thought, wow, if I was standing before someone who could give me everything that I want, like had all the power, all the authority, all the wealth, all the money to do for me exactly what I wanted. If that person was to ask me, praise, what is it that you want me to do for you? Would I be as willing as Nehemiah in their presence to pause and ask the Lord, what should I say? Give me the exact words so that I can say it. Verse 4 says, then Nehemiah prayed. Then he answered the king. And it pleases the king and he finds favor before the king. But I was left wondering, what do we believe about prayer? I kept asking myself, what do I believe about prayer? Do I believe that prayer is an invitation? Do I believe that prayer can change things? Do I believe that prayer quite literally can make me bolder, make me more excited, maybe calm me down? Do I believe that prayer is a two-way conversation, that it's not just me telling the Lord what I need Him to do for me or how I need Him to fix my life? But do I believe that prayer is also God's invitation to speak to us? That as we sit in His presence and tell Him what we need, that He's also willing to speak to us. That the Creator of heaven and earth creates time, not just when we pause in silence, but throughout our day, in vehicles, in transportation, in just our day-to-day life, that the Maker of the earth creates time to speak to us. What do I believe about prayer? Because you see, in chapter 1, Nehemiah prays, and his prayer is bold. He tells God who he is. He reminds God, hey, you are the sovereign God. You are good. You are perfect. And then he tells God, we know, like, he's like, I know we've sinned. I know we're in this mess because we've done wrong. We've been unfaithful to you. But then he goes a step further and he says, God, would you make me the change for my generation, for my time? And then when he steps out in boldness to ask the king for help, he does the same thing again. He prays. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like for me, prayer has oftentimes been trivialized in my day-to-day life. I don't know if it's because people ask for prayer so often around me and I forget to pray for them. You know, like when people say, hey, would you pray with me about this thing? And you're like, yes, I'll pray. And sometimes they don't even ask for prayer, but you offer it, but you don't actually do it. I'm that person. I forget, okay? If I don't pray for you in the moment, I forget. And sometimes when there's a massive outcry, a massive uproar in our culture, oftentimes people of God have responded with thoughts and prayers. Our thoughts and prayers are with you. And that's made people angry because in that moment, people are like, no, we want you to do something. We want to see your faith in action. We don't just want your thoughts and your prayers. And so I don't know about you, but for me, oftentimes I wrestle. I wrestle if prayer can actually change my life or change my situation. I wrestle sometimes to believe if prayer is powerful or if it's doing anything, because I've had prayers unanswered. I've had prayers that I've prayed and entrusted with God, and I'm still praying about them. And sometimes I even forget those prayers until I see that same prayer answered in somebody else's life, and all of a sudden it stings a little because they get to have an answered prayer and I don't. But Nehemiah, in the presence of feeling like he knows that the only person that can help him fulfill the call that God has placed in his heart is the king, he pauses and he prays. And I want to ask us this evening, how often do we pray when we're anxious, when we're overwhelmed, when we're distressed, when we're panicked? Where does prayer rank on our list of things to turn to when we're in seasons of distress or frustration? Is it the first thing we turn to, or is it the thing we turn to after we've called a friend? For me, I've called my mom, I've cried, and then I'm like, okay, I need to like think this out, write it out, make a plan. And then I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't pray about this. Where does prayer rank in our day-to-day lives? And I don't know, some people find it easy to pray in situations of anguish and frustration. It's easy. You're just like, oh my goodness, God, help me. And sometimes I don't know, maybe if life is going good and everything is right and there's nothing wrong with our world or the people around us, maybe we find it harder to pray in those moments. But what do you believe about prayer? And why do you find it difficult or easy to pray? When Nehemiah is asked this question, how can I help you? He pauses and he prays. And this week, as I was reading through Nehemiah 2, I kept thinking about another passage of scripture in Matthew 20, where Jesus asks a similar question to the one that the king asks of Nehemiah. See, in Matthew 20, it's a beautiful story about these two blind men. They find Jesus, and Jesus looks at them, and his words to them quite literally are, what do you want me to do for you? And the men with boldness, they declare, they look at Jesus and they say, we want our sight to be renewed. Let's go ahead and read that portion of scripture. It's Matthew 20:32 to 34. It says, Jesus stopped and called them. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. Lord, they answered, we want our sight. Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes, and immediately they received their eyesight and followed him. And when I was thinking about this idea that Nehemiah stops to pray, at multiple times on his narrative in this journey of rebuilding the walls and doing the thing that God has placed on his heart. I kept thinking about this question from God being an invitation to all of us. That time and time again, in the morning, in the evening, when you choose to pray, that Jesus has his arms stretched wide and he's asking of each of us, what do you want me to do for you? That is constantly Jesus's posture. Now, whether he does the thing immediately the way I thought he would do it, his posture towards me consistently is, praise, what do you want me to do for you? And I pray that that would be our mindset when we think about prayer, that we would delight in prayer as opposed to just checking it off our list. I remember when I was young, we'd sing this song before we would have a meal, or would sing and pray before we went to bed, that we would do it beyond those moments, but engage with prayer, knowing that there is true power, true peace that comes from the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords looking at us and saying, hey, what do you want me to do for you? And just like in Matthew 20, in Nehemiah 2, we see that God softens the heart of the king. That the king doesn't only give Nehemiah what it is that he requested for. In fact, Nehemiah gets extra, right? He's asking for letters, he gets letters. But he also gets timber. He gets an army, he gets some cavalry to go with him, some chariots. He gets extra because God's presence, the favor of God is on him. And Nehemiah tells us time and time again that God's presence is with me. I feel the presence of the Lord. But it's interesting because then we would assume that because Nehemiah has such an easy time convincing his employer, the king, to then get access to going back, to get some time off. The king even asks him, hey, when will you be back? Like, you're taking a work leave. When will you come back? He gets so much favor to go and he gets extra, and would assume that maybe from here on out, his journey would be easy. But no, Nehemiah faces opposition. And that was hard for me when I looked at the text. Why would Nehemiah face such opposition? In fact, chapter 2 ends in verse 19 with Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem all voicing their dissent. Nehemiah, what are you doing? Do you even have permission to be here? And you would assume that oftentimes when we feel like we've been called by God to do something, we've been called by God to pursue a dream or to fix an issue, that we wouldn't face opposition. But time and time and time again, I'm reminded that anytime we're trying to change the problems around us, anytime we're trying to come up against injustice, anytime we're trying to be the ones who are speaking truth to power, or just in our own little way, in our offices, in our schools, in our spaces of influence, being kind, turning the other cheek, that we will face opposition. So I wondered and I kept asking myself, so what do we do? What do we do when we feel like we're doing the exact thing that God has called us to do, but it's hard? And when you look at the book of Nehemiah, this isn't the first time that Nehemiah will face opposition. As the story continues of his life and him rebuilding the temple, and there's a point where the walls of Jerusalem, there's a point where he has to go back to Persia where he was working before. He faces opposition time and time again. In verse 12 of Nehemiah 2, Nehemiah proclaims that this is what God has put in my heart for me to do. He's deeply convinced, but yet opposition has a way of making us feel like we're all in it alone. Because already when God calls you to step out boldly to do something, maybe to say yes, to pursue a dream, whatever it is that God may be asking you to do. And for some of us, it's as easy as you just need to detach from certain habits and certain patterns and rhythms that you are accustomed to. Oftentimes that opposition is instant. We went through a season of fasting with a couple of my colleagues sometime, I think 2 weeks ago. It was 40 days of fasting. And I promise you, day one of fasting, that lunchtime, somebody texted me and said, Praise, I want to buy you lunch. And I was like, opposition. Because how is it that this whole year I haven't been fasting? And on the one day, the first day that I say I'm going to do this fast, someone is like, you know what? I'm going to buy you all you can eat at your favorite place. And that kept happening to me this 40 days. It was one thing after the next, after the next, after the next of just offers of food. And everybody wanted to take me to like all my favorite places to have sushi and like salads with avocado. Yum. Opposition. But sometimes the opposition isn't external. Sometimes the opposition is internal. It's as though we know that God has called us to do something and we are scared. And so there's self-doubt. We talk ourselves out of the thing that God has called us to do. We tell ourselves, I'm not smart enough. This problem that God is asking me to solve might never actually get solved. Why me? You know, the disciples had a similar thing when Jesus was saying, hey, let's go and, help the poor. And they were like, but wouldn't the poor always be with us? And sometimes that's us. We find ways to sort of convince ourselves that it's not us. Surely God cannot be calling me in my workplace, in my space, in this world to be the bold one. God cannot be calling me to be the person who's so vocal about my Christianity on social media. Surely it cannot be me. And so sometimes that opposition is not external, it's internal. So then we're back to this question, what do we do when we face opposition, but we're so convinced that it's God who's called us? So I don't know how many people in here love history, but I love history. I am obsessed with history, and not just history of nations. I love the history of food, the history of countries, the history of people. And I'm also an avid supporter of the sports, like any sport. I just enjoy sitting and watching sports. So the Olympics, Simone Biles, yay. But as I was thinking about opposition, I thought about this story in the Olympics that took place in 1968, at the 1968 Olympics. There were two young men, all American, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, at the Olympics that year. And then there was an amazing story. So I was reading through just different stories of what I would call resistance or opposition at the Olympics. And so in 1968, during the Summer Games, there was, different people coming to run and do, different athletes coming. And some of these athletes happened to be African American athletes. And so Tommy Smith and John Carlos were running track, and they were African American athletes. And there was a controversy over them because of the way that they'd been treated behind the scenes at the Olympics. People wouldn't sit with them. People wouldn't sort of like just engage with them. And so when they were going up to the podium to be sort of honored for, running the race, they raised what was a controversial at the time in 1968, at the political landscape at the time. They raised a fist of salute in the air as a way to signal human rights, or just to say, hey, what we've experienced here hasn't been okay. And as you read through their narrative and their story, it's amazing that even after all that they experienced, after getting onto the Olympic Village and all the things that happened to them, they still choose to show up. They still choose to run. They still choose to interact with their friends. They never lose hope or lose sight of why they were there. They want to sit with their other runners. They want to engage with the space. And I kept thinking, am I strong enough, bold enough to keep going even when I'm facing opposition? Nehemiah keeps building. He keeps building. And there's a point in the story where literally they're building, and some people are on the lookout. Some people have swords. Like, they're building this wall in such resistance. Resistance from the people living in Jerusalem at the time. Resistance from within the Israelite community. Everybody just not being on the same page. Am I willing to keep going even when I face opposition? Whether that's coming from external people outside, or whether that's coming from my own thoughts. And so when I thought about this question, what do we do in light of opposition? I pray that our posture would be to go back to prayer. That like Nehemiah, we would go back to God and say, God, I need assurance that it is you who called me and I didn't bring myself here. I need assurance that I'm not in this by myself. I need assurance that the same God who I have seen time and time again be faithful will be faithful for me now. So as we end today, I want us to spend some time in prayer, praying over 3 specific issues. One is for maybe anyone in the room who feels as though God has called them to do something hard. Like, in your heart, there's a burden that God has called you to go out. And maybe for some of us, it's a bold burden. Maybe you're like going to run for president. I don't know. you know? But maybe for some of us, not huge things. It's like things that we could do but are wrestling. Maybe you've been feeling in your heart to maybe host community group or start teaching in maybe the youth spaces, or maybe God is calling you to just share your story, your life story, with a friend at work or a friend in your school. But it feels hard. For some weird reason, it feels hard. We're going to pray today for boldness, that you would step out in faith, that whatever it is that holds you back from fully believing and trusting God, that would sort of just like be broken through this week. And then we're going to pray for those people as well in the room who already are following God. You know what God's call is on your life. You've seen a burden in society and you're meeting that need. You're volunteering. You're out there. You've started a business. You are helping a community. And we would pray that as you face different opposition, whether that's internal or external, that God would assure you that you're not alone, that you're not doing this by yourself, that even when it gets harder, He's right there with you. And He's promised that He'll never leave you or forsake you. And then the last group of people that we're going to believe as a community together for tonight is anyone who doesn't believe prayer works. Like maybe you believe that God can do miracles for everybody else, but maybe not you. And maybe when you stop to pray and you choose to pray for other people, your faith is strong. You're like, when you pray for that healing, when you pray for salvation for that friend, when you pray for that person to see the right way, you believe so strongly. But when it comes to praying for yourself, praying for something to change or for breakthrough to happen for yourself, you just can't. And I pray that tonight we would pray this bold prayer that the disciples asked Jesus in Matthew 6, Lord, teach us how to pray. That in our times of prayer, we would delight in prayer. That we wouldn't just go through the prayer moment, but we would spend some time doing that. So the band is going to sing and play, and I just want to invite us to pray. We can pray for ourselves, but if you need prayer, the prayer team is going to be on the sides up here and at the back. Let's reach out and let's just trust God as a community, that the same God who gave Nehemiah boldness, He's still the same God today. He can give us boldness to step out and do hard things well. He can give us assurance that He's with us when we're facing opposition. And He can encourage us that even though our prayers have not been answered and we've prayed for things year in, year out, and we're still struggling, that He hears us and He knows us by name. So let's spend some time praying.